Hello, and welcome to Why Do We Do That? A psychology podcast that deconstructs human behavior from the perspectives of social scientists, psychologists, and others that use applied psychology in their work. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Moyer. In this episode, I sat down with Dr. Barbara Kelly to discuss the topic of divorce. Barbara is a licensed psychologist with over 24 years of experience who specializes in family matters, such as marriage planning, co-parenting, and divorce. Barbara earned her PhD in counseling psychology from the University of Miami and has since focused her efforts on developing a skill set for supporting out-of-court dispute resolution alternatives to adversarial litigation. She has served on multiple professional boards and engaged with numerous community groups and professional organizations. She currently maintains a private practice serving the Central Florida community. I reached out to Barbara because I wanted to have a discussion about why people get divorced, the common thought patterns that divorcing partners engage in, and to elicit some practical tips on how to successfully navigate divorce. Barbara's comforting demeanor immediately stood out to me as a signature strength in her efforts to help conflicting individuals successfully navigate divorce. One thing I took away from our talk was that even though the signs of an impending divorce are often visible months or even years prior to the actual paperwork being filed, it doesn't mean that both parties are expecting divorce to be the outcome. Humans are quite good at self-deception and ignoring just how dysfunctional their most intimate relationships might actually be. I found it enlightening to hear Barbara discuss some key principles that people can apply when attempting to detach from their partners. Another interesting thing I learned from Barbara was that when it comes to children experiencing negative outcomes from divorce, it is the amount of conflict that is the primary driver, not necessarily the divorce itself. Divorce can obviously generate strong emotions from all parties involved, but it was encouraging to hear that co-parenting is possible when both parties are willing to make the children's well-being a priority. While I think this episode will be tremendously beneficial to those in the midst of a marital separation, I also think that it contains insights that can be applied to any close relationship, even ones that are already strong to begin with. Enjoy. Okay, today I am joined by Dr. Barbara Kelly. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
So, Barbara is a psychologist who specializes in divorce and helping couples navigate the ins and outs of divorce, both in the legal system and in the mental health aspect of divorce as well, and helping navigate those dynamics and challenges. And so I asked Barbara on because I'm personally very curious about these dynamics and the mistakes people make when going through divorce. And I also think that it's just an interesting area that the general public who doesn't necessarily have direct experience with divorce, I think there are going to be some interesting insights into this process and so on and so forth. So let's start by going over some of the most common reasons behind divorce, and whether or not you think that there are any themes that emerge from these common reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, divorce has kind of become a more common experience for many families and couples. And on the other hand, for the person that it's happening to, it's a very unique experience for that person or that couple. Although we have more people who are married now and contemplating divorce that experience divorce as kids. And so, when statistically, when people sort of try to survey and find out why people get divorced, The surveys will come up and say sometimes things like the majority of people talk about a lack of commitment to the marriage. After that, it might be infidelity. After that, there's domestic violence will come up or something like addiction or something like that. In my practice, I think I see that, but the way that lack of commitment shows up is that I would say the majority of couples I work with, at least one of them feels like their partner didn't work hard enough at the marriage and that it could have been saved. And so people give lots of different reasons. Sometimes they'll identify a specific conflict or specific event, but oftentimes, I think the marriage starts to fall apart over how conflict is managed, whether there's a lack of facing conflict, kind of an avoidance of conflict, or the way that conflict occurs. Somebody deals with their feelings, or both partners deal with their feelings in a way that is demeaning to the other person, or critical, or stonewalling, or hurtful in some other way that kind of tears down that feeling of safety and connection in the relationship.
So would you go so far as to say that, even the most even the best, most stable couples, they're going to have conflict, generally speaking, but it's the methods that they're using to deal with the conflict that's what's predicting whether or not the relationship continues to grow and sustain versus get worse?
Yep. So I think, in terms of just my experience, and I think the data is pretty clear, it's not really how much couples argue, it's how they argue to some great degree, or how they don't argue. Some couples really avoid that conflict and it just sort of goes away and comes back and goes away and comes back, and finally somebody has had enough. But really learning how to communicate about your needs. Some people feel like they don't have a voice in the relationship, and sometimes that's because the other person quiets their voice in a way that can be hostile or aggressive. But sometimes, especially women, tend to silence their voice, and be more passive and more accommodating. And I say that, but men do it too, because I see that as well. And so sometimes you can almost forget that you're the one that sort of didn't take the steps to kind of put your voice out there in a way that it could be heard.
Now, I can see breakdown of conflict resolution going one of two ways. On one hand, it might be the idea that, you know, the individuals that are attempting to resolve the conflict, they just lack the acumen, they lack the skill set in order to resolve conflicts, but they really, really want to. On the other hand, I can also see it being more common that individuals have the ability, they just start to lack the will to even care about their partner's feelings, in the sense that, you know, you just decide at some point that you're not happy and then you give up on conflict resolution altogether. Which do you think is more common, or is it just a mix?
Yeah. I think it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. Because I think when most people get married, they start to see some issues or some problems or something they thought they feel differently now that was okay before isn't okay now. And they might make some attempts to try and solve it. And if those attempts, they feel like they met with enough failure or criticism or rejection, or it was ignored, different people have a different sense of how much they'll persevere on that and when they'll give up. And I think, once somebody starts to emotionally disconnect, they can stop caring and stop trying. So you lose that connection, and people can start to look to meet their needs or emotional needs elsewhere, or just kind of further disconnect from their partner. And also, I think that they can start to engage in something that, clinically we call it negative emotional override, where you start to see everything that your partner does through this lens of they're always trying to criticize me. Nothing I do is good enough. They're not listening to me. And so your partner really can't do anything right at that point.
Yeah, it reminds me, there's in grad school, in some of my seminars, we talked about the nonlinear change that sometimes occurs in relationships. And what is meant by that is, when you start a relationship with someone, you like them, your relationship grows through intimacy and experience. And if you picture that on a chart, they're digging a deep hole in your identity, in the sense that they're super meaningful. They get to they start to become tied into your life. They have a very deep connection to who you are. And one thing that doesn't happen is you cannot go from a deep love of someone to neutral. That, it just doesn't work that way. It would be like if you were a football fan, you're a Miami Dolphins fan, and you eventually you start to dislike the Bills. But there is no in between if you're a Dolphins fan. Like, you have to dislike the Bills if you're a Dolphins fan. But in the sense of the relationship, it's it's almost impossible to go from deep love to neutral, or not, or apathy. And so it seems as though you have to have an equally extreme reaction to your partner, that if the relationship starts to go poorly, you start building up these negative thoughts like, oh, I don't like how they do that, or this is starting to bother me. They're not addressing this. They're not addressing this. And then just immediately just flips from all positive to all negative. And it almost sounds, it's not exactly the same as what you're saying with this overload, but this non-linear, it doesn't, you don't just go back to neutral. It goes from like intense love to potentially intense dislike.
So another way to say that maybe is that intimacy is intimacy. When we develop that intimacy, that attachment to that, that other person that's our soulmate that we come close to, that really gets in our skin. It's that deeply enduring bond that we connect, that, and we're intimate. We've built trust. We've shared things. That intimacy doesn't just go away. And so when it's a positive intimacy and something happens, it flips from positive intimacy to negative intimacy. And that's why sometimes when people are separating from each other or breaking up or divorcing, we know how to bring a smile to our partner's face, and we also know how to really hurt them.
Yeah.
Because that intimacy, that it's like that switch flips from positive to negative. The way that you move through grieving a relationship is working through detaching and grieving and losing that level of intimacy. And that's how people get on the other side and heal, is because we kind of back that intimacy out and work through it.
So it's also interesting, talking about the time frame, because I think a lot of individuals, when they separate, they have this expectation that it's going to happen much, much more quickly than it actually does. Like, it actually takes a very long time to kind of detach yourself from another person. In your experience, do you find that people have this expectation that might be unrealistic about how quickly the process is supposed to take?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to remember, to think about, is divorce is kind of a systems process. It always involves you and another person, and it could involve children, it could involve extended family, right? So divorce typically, or separation typically, starts for the most part at a different point in time for each spouse or each partner. And so usually, in my experience, the person that, you know, you know, both or one partner may really wrestle with this decision, how to solve a problem, and you try and work on solving it. You try all different kinds of things before you get to this idea that divorce is the solution to this problem. I'm going to move forward. And by the time that spouse or that partner puts that forward and has made that decision, they've already started that grief process and that detachment process a long time ago, or for some time before. For the other person in the couple, if they haven't been working on
Right.
this is when their grief process starts. And so for them, so what happens then when couples are separating or moving through a divorce process, we have a pacing or kind of timing piece to look at. And so sometimes, that's part of my job is kind of coaching each person to recognize where the other partner is in terms of their emotional detachment and their grief process and pacing how we're going to do this. And so the person who's been wrestling with it, they're ready to get it done yesterday. They want it to be like a haircut, make an appointment, go in, get my haircut and move on because it's been going on so long for them. For their partner, it's just starting. And so if they're starting a legal divorce at that point, they're being asked to make a lot of decisions while they're still in that new grief stage of protest and trying to understand this and maybe even trying to still reconcile.
Is
And they,
it for the person that has been that is ahead further down the line that has been thinking about it much longer and planning in some cases, are there best practices for how to interact with that partner that was blindsided? I can imagine in some cases that the blindsided partner is going to be engaging in a ton of behaviors designed, I'm so sorry, repair, it'll never happen again. And chances are, if this has been a long decision, that initiating partner is not going to be interested in that. Do you think that are there some best practices for the initiator to converse with the blindsided partner?
I think that's a really good question because I do think from the divorce side, and know that big part of my practice is also working with couples who want to stay together. So I kind of get to see both sides of the coin and premarital counseling and things like that. And so, and people who are trying to reconcile. And so, how a person makes that divorce decision and conveys that, for me, I think that's one of the most critical pieces in how couples move forward with their divorce. So I think it is really something for that initiator to really think about. Some people, it's really hard to communicate about it and they don't. And so their partner gets served, they find another relationship and move forward for support in some way or some other thing that is a breach of trust. I think that sometimes starting the conversation, if you really don't know how to do it, starting the conversation with some third party help can really be helpful. Going individually, if you're not sure how to talk about it, to have somebody help coach you in how to raise this issue with your partner. Usually there's been some talk prior to somebody saying, really, I'm done. There's been communication, there's been arguing, but really try and take control of it yourself and think about how you want to convey that so that it doesn't end up being an argument that got out of control. And so something happens and it feels more okay to leave because you're angry, or because there's a new person and your partner finds out or those kinds of things. And so I think it's really, for couples that don't have communication, this is really challenging. And that's where I think it can be helpful to get some coaching for your specific situation.
Well, and I would also imagine, like in some cases, there has to be sort of a reaction that can be, let's say let's say the hypothetical that it's a female and they're initiating a divorce with someone with some narcissist tendencies, right? Who is very insecure, who's not really going to accept any sort of separation. To what are there some strategies that you would recommend for someone that's going through that? And what I'm thinking is, you might have a conflict deciding whether or not you reply to text messages. How do you ignore certain efforts? Do you there seems to be some really confusing situations when someone is really has a fervent desire to keep the relationship together. I'm curious if you've encountered any of those types of scenarios.
Yep. For sure, and there can be a lot of different dynamics around why that happens, but certainly there's a phase where somebody's can be the one leaving and they still feel friendship or care and concern for their partner and they want to be supportive. But for the partner who's still, again, in this initial grief stage, that can feel really confusing. It can feel like oh, look, they're here, they're helping at the house, their hopes go up, and then they feel let down again. And so people feel like, shouldn't I respond? Should I not respond? I think it's really consistently being clear with your partner that I'm really moving forward with this, putting some steps in place. Sometimes it is going ahead and bringing in lawyers or a lawyer consult, and couples can do that now together. A lawyer can't represent both of you, but there are lawyers who will do a joint consult to help couples get started in terms of that reality piece. For if you have a partner who is engaging in really unhealthy or maybe say over the top kind of trying to re-engage you kinds of things, there's a book by a gentleman named Bill Eddy. He was a lawyer back and became a social worker. And he has a book called BIF, Brief, Informative, Firm, and Friendly. And he talks about how it's for workplace as well as families. But it gives a good idea of how to kind of respond in some of those situations, which is really to be brief. Sometimes we accidentally say, okay, honey, or, you're kind of turning things inside out. And that's not always healthy. I will tell you, if you have not set boundaries with your partner and you start to do it in the middle of a divorce process, it's not going to change things right away.
So let's pivot a little bit and talk specifically about infidelity. Obviously, infidelity is in the top 5 of reasons why people get divorced. In your experience, what are the determinants of whether or not a relationship can move past an act of infidelity?
So not all, we're psychologists and we get everything complicated, right? Not all infidelity is the same. I think it really boils down to the level of the breach of trust that's been perceived and whether there's trauma connected to it or not. And so and then the motivation of both partners to come back from that. It really takes both partners to want to move past that.
So you wouldn't, in terms of looking at a situation that a couple is discussing, are you saying that it's basically for the victim, it's what you're willing to live with versus what you're not willing to live with? Is that how you would advise someone?
No, I don't think
Okay.
so.
Okay.
I think what counts is if, we'll say victim, the person on the receiving end of the infidelity for sure. It's their subjective experience of how traumatic this was for them and what the breach of trust is for them. And then the willingness, how much they want to commit to reconciliation and how much their partner is willing to commit. Because that partner has to be willing to engage in trust rebuilding. And not all partners are willing to do that and go through it, what it takes to do that. The person who is been cheated on has to be willing to also work through their feelings of hurt and anger and give that other person a chance to build trust. And that's where individually personal resilience kind of shows up. For some people, that's something they could do. For others, they can't. Sometimes that breach of trust and that trauma related to it is just too much. And then the root cause of the infidelity has to get addressed. One thing I sort of see in couples who are getting divorced down the road is that there might have been a brief early infidelity in the relationship and they somehow got past it, but they never really resolved it and it never really goes away. And
So
it just
that
is
relates. That's interesting. That speaks to my next question, where I'm going, specifically related to, you said there might have been an early infidelity that was patched up, and then something else happens that triggers some unaddressed feelings. I'm curious as to, out of all of the reasons that you hear from individuals initiating a divorce, in your experience and from what you gather from the history that you're gathering from these individuals who are speaking with you, how often are the reasons that people are bringing up, how long have they been clearly present since the beginning of the relationship? I know that, there's a stereotype of relationships of sometimes there's the fixer and the project, and even though a couple might be in love, one of them might have this relationship pattern of overlooking things, overlooking negative traits in their partner, and seeing them as, well, we love each other, we have a strong relationship, we have a strong attraction, but all these negatives, I over time can fix this individual. So I'm curious as to how often this happens, where the traits or the issues have been there since day one versus developed over time through the relationship.
Yeah, and that scenario you're bringing up, that's kind of the on the back end when the relationship is ending, somebody may be saying, I never thought she'd change and she did, and she's a different person. Or I always thought he would change in some way. Some people marry their partner for who they are today, and some marry their partner for who they hope they'll be. We create a photo album in our head of pictures where we think things are going to land. I think that also sometimes there's things that might have been okay early in the relationship for somebody. And as people go through their own personal growth and development, those things no longer become okay. And then they become harder and harder to tolerate. And so there's a looking back that says, that was there early on. We were young. It was kind of okay. But now I'm realizing, gosh, I can't believe that I used to let him do that, or I used to let her do that.
Interesting. Yeah, it also makes me think of, again, the importance of communication and conflict resolution, because I think it's common for people in relationships to, like, it makes sense that your tolerance of a certain behavior might change, right? Everyone is entitled to have changing opinions and changing feelings. And I mentioned communication because I think part of the disconnect there is that the partner isn't willing to share that their feelings are changing, because they might be, it's always, you might be afraid to rock the boat or something like that. But if they were to share their feelings, like just point blank say, listen, I I used to feel this way about this behavior, and now it bothers me more, and we need to address it. I feel like that's a skill that is a little bit more advanced in terms of something that couples don't engage in enough.
Yeah, and so that brings up my other piece of that I think is a really important part that we don't always talk about as much, which is being a good listener as a partner too. Because, when you're first dating somebody, you find out all kinds of things about them. You know how they like their coffee, you know what their favorite dessert is, you know what they like to do. We're constantly updating our schema of that person and our knowledge of that person. And at some point in time, we get married and kids and work and all that stuff sort of takes over, and we don't continue to update that. Or our partner can talk to us, but the other spouse has to receive it and listen and respond and be curious.
Interesting.
What does that mean? Versus a defensive response.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember reading this book by James Sexton called "If You're in My." It's written by a divorce. He's a divorce attorney, and he says the name of the book is "If You're in My Office, It's Already Too Late." And yeah, he mentions that he likes to reduce it down to, do you care about your partner? Like, do you care about them still? Because that's how not only is that good for the relationship to progress, but it's also something that needs to be there after the divorce, like during the mediation process. If you care about the person at all, you should be able to to do these behaviors and like as you were talking about the importance of listening, listen and pay attention to anything that might be changing and evolving over time.
That should word is what gets people in trouble because, okay, so, it's kind of like this rule book, this should word, but that doesn't mean we always can um, do it or we have the capacity to do it. And so, in some ways, we ask a lot of people when they get married because, this is just my thinking on the subject. When people get married, regardless of where you get married, there's always a marriage license that you sign at some point in that process. There's a marriage license. And essentially, that marriage license is the signature page of a contract that is a legal contract that none of us read. None of us read. And none of us really care about what it says. And it gets to be updated over the years. And we don't get an update notice until we're going to get divorced. And then all of a sudden, what that current version of that marriage contract is all of a sudden matters. And the legal part matters. But the reality is the legal part isn't the big part of the marriage, So more and more of some of the work I'm doing is helping partners develop their partner contract or their marriage contract, where we're talking about how are you going to manage conflict as you go forward. Because it's all about expectations. We can say the same things. We both want to have good communication, but that might mean something different to one person than the other. We have different styles. Education's important. For example, people have values, and this is a big one that comes up. Education's important to both of us. We want to make sure our kids have an education. But underneath that, there could be a different value, which is how much do we as parents sacrifice to provide that funding for education? How much do we expect our kids to work for that? And all of a sudden, there's this confusion. Why we're on the same page? Why are we fighting over this? And so taking some time, I feel like we do couples a disservice by not providing enough support and scaffolding for them to have those kind of conversations in a little bit more depth. It's scary to have sometimes when you're like getting ready to like get married and you don't want to rock the boat. But I think we can provide more support for people to understand how to work that through and build the skills to do that on the front end.
So let's talk for a second about your mediation experiences because I'm interested in the hostile separation where you may have some you may have some property, you might have children. We're going to get to children after this, but before we do that, I want to talk about if you've found some frameworks or approaches that are effective when dealing with couples that are highly combative. Is there a way of framing their separation that lowers the temperature?
Yeah. So so for me, a starting place is really understanding for each person what their hostility is about and how they're feeling. That's the really important part. And then what their goals are. Really, what are your goals for what you want to have happen here? Sometimes somebody's really angry and upset because, I've had women say something like, I feel like I'm just being kicked to the curb like the trash. Or somebody saying, I think I'm just being viewed as a breadwinner. And sometimes when you're working with a couple in a more facilitative or, in a legal environment, each lawyer only gets to talk to their client most of the time. And, I have the benefit of talking to both partners. And so sometimes I can facilitate a way that we can address some of those concerns and that they can be either discussed or we can come up with a creative solution that helps address some of that. If not, or may not be capable of that, then how does that individual person start to work through some of those feelings as much as they can and understanding that that's important? And can we create some space and time for that? For people that really want to move through the process, there's a lot of strong feelings. Sometimes we meet separately and we just don't try and do that. And I know, and I hope that they have a legal process, a mediation process with that divorce process. It doesn't add any more trauma or distress to them or as minimized as possible to their relationship. And that hopefully it sets them on a path that they can go forward and they can do better individually or together.
I've spoken to, I have some acquaintances who are going through divorce, and I hear them talk about how, I mean, and this is in this specific example that I'm thinking of, they have a great deal of disdain for their former partner. And I hear them complain. I see their stress about it. And part of me is just a little confused because it seems as though it would be not only would it help the relationship and dealing with the children that are involved, but it's also just good for you to let things play out a little bit, take a little bit more hands off the wheel approach. It seems like there's this metaphorical punching or boxing match that's going back and forth where it's, well, you're going to do this, I'm going to do this. You're going to do this, I'm going to do this. And I'm always baffled because it seems as though the the effort that you're putting in is not paying off. It's not making you feel better. I don't see any tangible benefits from this process. Um, have you had any success getting through to these types of personalities or addressing these types of conflicts?
Okay, so you mentioned children, so I'm going to talk about that. But before I do that, I'm going to sort of speak to another part of that, which is that's that flip between positive intimacy and negative intimacy. These are two people who have not moved on from each other yet. And so we might be looking individually at how they can begin to do that, and what's keeping that from happening, because we want to move that forward. When there's kids involved, my focus really is to help parents be more child focused. Divorce is a super emotional process. And even when parents are working well together, they can be physically present for their kids, but not emotionally present because they're going through this whole emotional process themselves. And they don't always see their kids' experiences until after the fact when their own emotions settle down. And so helping parents really see what this looks like from a kid perspective, that you as parents are writing a story that your children will have for the rest of their lives. Whether you are writing the story you intended to or not, this is the story they're having. And so if we can help parents create a space where they can pause, not be reactive, but choose the story they want their kids to have and do their best to provide that story for their kids, that's a pivotal place.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of couples that are navigating divorce with children, there's this common phrase of stay together for the kids. The folk wisdom that, divorce is going to be very hard on your children. Perhaps it might be in your best interest to patch things up or continue the relationship for the sake of the children. Of course, that's a loaded sentiment, right? Because oftentimes kids are very perceptive. They know that something is wrong. They might know something is fatally flawed and dysfunctional about the relationship, depending on how old the children are. And so, is this idea of keeping the relationship together, avoiding divorce for the sake of the kids, is this ever a viable option?
Well, it can be. I think if you have kids, it's really worth really contemplating the concept of staying together for these kids, because kids would prefer to be in an intact family. They would prefer that, and there's benefits. And we have some data about what kids lose in a divorce to some degree. However, we also have pretty good data that indicates the level of conflict kids are exposed to is really, to some degree, the overriding factor. So there was a study that came out some years ago looking at kids raised in an intact family and then kids raised in kind of what I think the study authors felt were kind of the co-parenting, good co-parenting kind of post-divorce families. And they thought they'd find like these differences between kids of divorced parents and kids of intact parents. And they didn't really get the findings they were looking for until they divided each of those groups into high conflict and low conflict. And then what they found is kids who are in high conflict intact and high conflict divorced had the poorer outcomes overall in general. So we're looking at that level of conflict exposure. So that really is a tipping point. We know that post-divorce conflict is really that one factor that we have control over that we know can be the most damaging to kids. Protracted conflict. Kids are resilient; they can get past that if the conflict ends. Conflict about the children is actually the most damaging of the different conflicts they can be exposed to. And so I think each parent has to kind of think about that for themselves, but that is a big factor. The other thing I will tell you, working with kids, which I continue to work with kids because that's the really cool part. You get to hear their perspective. And on the other side, some children definitely will say to me, little fifth grader, I really wish my parents weren't divorced, but my mom is so much happier and it's really a lot more fun to be with her. And I actually get
Wow.
to see my dad more. And so those are kind of some of the benefits for me. Um, and so I do hear that from kids as well. There is a concept I'll share with you now called the gray divorce. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but there is this increase in divorces 50 and over. And I suspect that the empty nest syndrome probably is a contributor to that. And I think there's
Hmm.
probably some data to back that up. So kids get out of the house, they go on, maybe parents were good parents together, realistically, or they were staying together for the kids. There's less of a divorce stigma now, and we're seeing a big increase in that population.
Interesting. Uh, so clearly, there are some considerations that parents have to have in navigating perhaps co-parenting. In many cases, it might be the case that there's shared custody where the kids are alternating. Um, what is your advice to parents, in terms of some behaviors that you might want to avoid as you go down this co-parenting journey after a separation?
Yeah, so essentially for kids, half of them comes from mom and half comes from dad. So if we speak negatively about either parent, children experience really kind of internalize that. And that's where we talk about that's where divorce can be damaging to kids in terms of their self-esteem. Sometimes there's things that kids appreciate about their other parent that we don't as parents, and so sometimes trying to see it through your kids' eyes, but really helping support your child to know that they are free to love both parents, that when you're with dad, I'm good, I'm okay, I'm not sad, I'm not sitting here missing you. Of course, I love you and I can't wait to see you, but you don't need to feel that you're somehow causing me to be sad. Or, parents are good at making some parents are good at like making little snide comments that kids pick up, like, oh, now that you're back, I'm going to make you a nice, good, nutritious dinner or something like that. Those are the kinds of things that just really kind of hurt kids. They just want to continue to have their life, be free to see both parents and not feel scared when their parents come together that there might be a conflict.
Interesting. So suppose that there is a situation where upon the separation, um, one parent is considering whether or not they want to fight for sole custody versus some sort of joint custody agreement. I imagine this is probably one of the most difficult decisions a parent might go through, um, especially because it seems as though it would be almost impossible to objectively determine if you're doing the right thing. It seems like it would be just lots and lots of gray. Um, how how would you frame this decision process for a parent? I mean, obviously, if they're worried about personal safety with one of the parents, that's sort of low-hanging fruit. Obviously, maybe you should argue for sole custody at least for a temporary period of time, but there's some other considerations that are not as clear. If the other parents uh, if their home isn't as clean, if their resources are limited, how do you frame this decision if a parent is trying to decide single versus joint custody?
some of that is probably going to be very dependent on the state the parent lives in and really what their legal options are, to be frank. And that's the part that's just can be so heartbreaking and frustrating and annoying for parents because, you know, most families don't go to court to solve their problems. Up until a divorce, parents have big disagreements.
Right.
I have yet to hear anybody like we're having a knockdown drag out about whether our kids are going to do travel ball or not. Nobody goes and hires lawyers and goes in front of a judge and asks them to make that decision because they think that's the best way. And then in a divorce, that's what we're kind of left with oftentimes. Not always, but sometimes if you're going to have a third party decision maker. And so it's that gray area that is really hard for parents, especially if it kind of borders on feeling like there might be some neglect or some safety concerns or those kinds of things. Ultimately, I do hear from parents, it can go either way. Actually just talked to a mom this morning. I had consulted with her when her kids were little bitty and she was trying to figure that out. And they're in elementary school now and doing okay. And she just circled back for just a co-parenting question. And it has all worked out for her. And they structured their time sharing arrangement so that the concern she had about the amount of time the kids were spending because of a particular concern in the other household, we managed that through the timeshare schedule, and it's been working okay, which is good to hear. So you do have other options in terms of how to potentially think about that in that parenting plan that parents will put together. You can put in whatever you want that you guys are going to have. You're going to take, you can ask for ongoing parenting classes or communication. You can put a therapist in place for the children to kind of help, or a third party. And so really maybe looking at some of those other creative resources, also knowing that it's hard because some things are really important. You want to address them on the front end and make sure that these concerns get addressed. I've done parenting plans where we put in a provision that says, if anyone takes the kids out on a boat, until the kids are this age, there will always be another adult on the boat, for example. Those are
So
specific.
how about so let's zoom in a little bit. How about in the case of a separation where both parents are civil? So let's take out the custody part for a moment. A scenario where there's shared custody and the parents are, let's just say they're civil. Almost certainly at some point, unless they had already been on the exact same page in terms of their parenting philosophy, there are going to be massive differences in parenting while they're at dad's and while they're at mom's, right? And I've seen real life examples where it's like the other party is just not creating the kind of environment that the other parent would like. And it gets very difficult to determine if it's something worth bringing up. Let's pretend that maybe dad, when kids are with dad, that they're disinterested in the children, for example. And mom is trying to decide, do you bring that up? Because, if you bring it up, it's just going to create more friction, right? There's this cost benefit thing where, if I say anything, this is going to rock the boat. It's going to create more, trouble. How does one go about determining which battles to pick and which ones to kind of leave alone?
Okay, good question. And the reality is when parents are in separate houses, their parenting can polarize. When you're in the same house, there's sort of some give and take that kind of keeps things a little more centered. They can get polarized. In your example that you give, if parents are getting along and they're pretty civil, sometimes parents have a parenting plan, they follow it, there's not a big deal, but there's low communication. That's a harder one to kind of tackle under those circumstances. If they're being civil and there's some level of communication that they're continuing and they have a paradigm for how to communicate, that's a little bit easier. So I do end up, I kind of coach parents in how to sometimes bring up that concern, which could be, again, how do you bring it up in a curious way and bringing up a concern for the kid way? Depending on the age of the children, are we providing them with what they need so that they can have a good voice? If there's enough communication between parents sometimes we want to, rather than assume like, oh my God, dad, you being disinterested in the kids is not good. I don't like that kind of thing, to just say, hey, I want to check in. feel like I'm hearing a little bit from Johnny that he's struggling with some of the differences in our house. Can we talk about it? I
I
want to check
see.
out something he said to me. Starting from that place to open a non-defensive communication, not
And
accusatory.
and I would also imagine that it would be kind of prickly discussing that with the kids as well, because you don't want to, like, you might observe something or clock something that the kids mentioned, and you don't want to paint a picture of dad as the bad party, but you also kind of want to fish and instill values in your children. Do you have any thoughts on how to have those conversations? Well, is it just like as simple as, well, in this house, these are our values, and then when you're with your other parent, these are the values of that house?
Yeah, so it's a little bit along that lines. It depends a little bit. So depends a lot on the developmental age of the child too, because again, we don't want to share more with our kids than we would normally at that age with them.
Right.
But sometimes, kids will say, I don't know, something like, dad says you're bad, for example, and I usually coach parents to take like do at least a couple of actions before you respond, because we interpret that question or that statement through our adult brain. So it might be, a reflective statement. He did. What do you mean by that? Well, you don't let us have green beans. Okay, that's what that is. Or it could be something else. Or if he did, what do you think about that? Just taking a couple steps so that you can kind of understand that a little bit better. I think lines like, sometimes your mom and I, how sometimes your mom and I just see things differently. This is one of those things.
So to wrap up, suppose that there's someone listening right now and they are sitting on the borderline of deciding if they think they need to pursue a divorce, or if they want to maybe give counseling a try and to repair the relationship. What are your thoughts with respect to how to know when it's time to go down that path in the first place?
I think most people go down that path when they know, like they know this is what I need to do. Most people get there where they know. When you're wrestling with it, when you're really wrestling with it, speaking to a trusted friend or advisor that will be really honest with you. Sometimes going to see a counselor together or even individually. There are therapists in town that do a process called discernment counseling, which does help couples that may have a mixed agenda or unsure. But I think sometimes having somebody that you can talk it out with. And then the other option or resource that I think you have is to go get educated so that you have a better idea. You may do a legal consult to get educated. You may do a mental health consult to get kind of educated about those options and kind of talk it through. But a lot of people tell me that they just got to a place where they knew that this was the right decision. Doesn't mean they don't go back and forth about it. But I think if you were feeling like your marriage, obviously if there's abuse or a huge trust breach, if you feel like, I've had people be really clear, they feel like they've had a lot of individual counseling and that really the reoccurring source of their depression is a relationship dynamic that can't be addressed, they may make that decision.
Yeah, and I've spoken with people who have had, been in this spot, and the bottom line is that sometimes it's okay for relationships to end. It's it doesn't even necessarily mean that you have to be resistant or upset necessarily. It's a framework that I've incorporated in some of my past relationships, which is this relationship began and it ran its course, and there wasn't necessarily an impetus. There wasn't necessarily well, this is what happened, and that is why we're ending the relationship. It's just this is just what has happened. And I've found that it's helped me kind of frame relationships, and I'm not sure if others feel the same way.
Yeah, so that happens for sure. And the ideal way that happens is both partners kind of get to that place where we say, this is not really the relationship we want for our life partner, or that intimacy, or that type of, we love each other but not that type of love, or those kinds of things. And people can usually part pretty amicably in those situations, but it is okay. People, I mean, and I think it's better to acknowledge that and move forward with that than sort of trying to create a reason that will justify the ending, because that, again, usually is a more traumatic ending for people.
Well, thank you so much for being on today, Dr. Barbara Kelly.
Thanks for having me.
For more on Barbara, visit kellypsychology.com. That's KELLYPSYCHOLOGY.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please share an episode with 2 of your friends. Head over to patreon.com/Why Do We Do That podcast to become a paid supporter of the show. You'll gain early access to episodes as well as bonus video content. Follow on Instagram or Facebook at Why Do We Do That podcast, or Twitter at WDWDTpod. Until next time, this is Dr. Ryan Moyer, hoping you found some answers to the question, why do we do that?